So welcome to the Goals-Based Investing webcast. I'm thrilled today to be joined by my very good friend, Margaret Towle. Welcome, Margaret.
Hi, Tony.
So this is a topic that you and I have been talking about, it seems like for years. Understanding ESG, understanding sustainable investing, understanding impact investing. And I think there's just a lack of understanding and clarity around what these strategies are, how they're different, and how they're used. And maybe we'll just start with the basic. How should advisors think about ESG? Is it an investment philosophy? Is it a factor? What is it?
I think that we're getting greater clarification now on what ESG is. And at least as far as investors, I would consider it complementary. It's one more tool that investors can use, and especially advisors working with clients in helping them understand where clients are going and how to get there. So from my perspective, it's not an investment philosophy. And the reason, Tony, that it's not is that an investment philosophy is something that is fairly long-lasting over time. And it has to do with what's driving your investment decisions. So an example would be growth managers or value managers. Instead, this is something that's more of a framework to look at what's going on in the portfolio.
So Margaret, you and I have been doing this for a long time. And it's something I hear a lot from advisors is this notion that, well, ESG is just all about feeling good, but there's a haircut, right? You're going to sacrifice performance because you're not going to be invested in certain securities. And I think that's more of the old school sort of view on SRI, which is negative screening. How do you respond when you hear those comments? And I know you've received the same sort of comments from advisors over the years.
I have. And for one thing, it's not an all or none. So ESG is a feel-good thing, but it's kind of like a free lunch, which I know you can't have a free lunch in investments, but it seems that way. So one of the things, Tony, you're absolutely correct in that historically, people considered socially responsible investing, which was primarily a negative screen. But what we've seen lately is the data are validating that not only can you invest with your values, but the actual performance advantage in certain areas, not in every market environment or any time, but it's been validated by numerous studies. And we can talk about why that is, but primarily it's because the market has changed. And it's changed from what would be tangible kind of investment opportunities to intangible or non-financial. And that would include things like, if we look at Amazon, Amazon's value is largely based in the cloud or online selling. It's not a warehouse or inventory or a widget. So that's what's changed, and we need a way to measure those non-financial factors. That's what ESG does.
So it's kind of a perfect setup to the other myth that I think we hear a lot about, and that is, we focus a lot on performance, but probably not as much around risk. And in fact, I've kind of cited in my book, which I see behind you, thank you, and some of the research that I've done on the topic, I think MSCI has shown that actually identifying good companies with good ESG scores is actually a strong risk measure because you're avoiding those big blowups. Talk to us a little bit about the risk side of the equation.
Yes, that is one very strong advantage. And in my perspective, it may even be a greater advantage than the performance advantage. Because what we've seen with ESG is both on the positive and negative risk side. So, people want positive risk, upside. But the downside drawdown is something that really protects the portfolio. From all of your work in the industry for many years that if you lose money, the amount that is required to make up that return is almost twice as much. And so if you can protect on the downside. So what ESG does is identify risk factors that would be things that that maybe are, let's use an example. For corporations, reputation and brand risk is an intangible thing, but it's very big. And ESG provides some kind of recognition of that kind of risk. And so, yes, risk management is very important for ESG investing.
And I think a lot of times I hear from advisors, it's all about the E, it's all about the environment. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the E, the S, and the G factors are all very valuable. And I would argue that if you can identify a good company with a good environmental footprint, with sound policies and procedures and engaged employees, that's a good company. So I think that in many respects, I think that if you're identifying and screening companies on those factors, you're avoiding those big blow up risks because you're eliminating those companies that are sole proprietors or somebody who takes on a lot of risk. So it's kind of a indirect byproduct of the way ESG screens out and identifies strong companies.
And that is true. And what you're talking about is the big picture, E, S, and G. And what the recent research is showing is that if we look at it one step down by industry, there are certain factors that are more material for some industries than others. So let's use the retail industry. If you look at a company like a Starbucks, a few years ago, Starbucks decided that they would offer college education for all their baristas. Well, in the retail industry, turnover of employees is one of the biggest factors in terms of profitability. So by retaining those employees with college education, they've managed to improve their bottom line. So yes, the E, S, and G are all important, but for some industries, E is more material than S, and for others, the G, G is a universal factor across all industries, but the industry and SASB, which is Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, has identified the material factors by industry. So you want to look at all, and there is an aggregate ESG score, but you also want to see what's material for that industry.
Yeah, and I guess the last myth, and this is something that I think is challenging for even those who are passionate about ESG, is the lack of consistency across databases. And, one methodology may screen a company one way and another, Refinitiv may screen one way versus Sustainalytics versus MSCI versus S&P. So I think one of the challenges, we don't really have that consistency across the board. How do we square all of that?
Yeah, I mean, first, the whole industry has come a long way in providing more robust data. But that doesn't mean we're at the place where, everything's great. And there's a chart that I look at that's correlation across all of the different database providers. And we actually see kind of a low correlation. And so that's a little bit of a challenge. So one way to do it is to examine what the underlying assumptions are of those databases, and also to look at it, as I mentioned earlier, on an industry by industry basis. And so if you're a growth manager and some of the ESG factors that you're looking at pertain to maybe growth companies more, and you feel that the vendor has a better handle on these growth non-financial factors, then you might go with that. But I think we're just going to have to wait and see till the industry gets a little more. And the other thing is that there are really no, SASB is the one, it's a voluntary thing though. And there really are no regulatory or uniform standards, at least in the United States, regarding what these metrics are.
Although, as you point out, we have come a long way. There's a lot more education around this, and we're at least hearing hints coming from the regulators that they want to standardize this because more and more investors are embracing ESG to align their portfolios and their purpose. I wanted to hit on an issue that's tangentially related, but I know it's something that's kind of near and dear to you. And I recall, as the editor of the Investment and Wealth Monitor, I wanted to do a profile of you because I think you've been so passionate about women in wealth, which I think aligns with this. how come we haven't come farther as an industry in promoting women? And how do you think we can do a better job preparing that next generation of women leaders across the industry? Because I do think it does align with this broader topic, because we all know more women leaders, more diverse set of views on boards is a positive thing, is a good thing overall for companies. But as an industry, I think we've kind of lagged behind for quite some time.
Have been some developments around that. NASDAQ has decided that boards must be diverse and have recommended that. And there's other steps as well. But one thing that I think is very important is that's starting at the top, the board level. But what the industry is looking at, and very innovative companies are doing, is starting at the very bottom, at the entry level. Because if you look at the statistics relative to that career path, there need to be more women recruited. But the other aspect of that is to really support women in their organizations. There's a woman at Harvard, an academic named Iris Bonet, who's written a book called What Works. And what she identified is the importance not of coaching per se, but of mentoring. And that's a stronger commitment than coaching. And the other thing that she brings up, and others have as well, is that training sometimes doesn't work. I know I worked for a very large financial services organization that did a great job training. But sometimes the training actually reinforces what might be negative stereotypes. It wasn't necessarily at my firm, but there are at other firms. And so the training is part of it. And also just what you mentioned, the recognition that there has to be systemic structural changes within corporations to support women throughout their career path.
And I've always argued that I think it's important for women and minorities in general to see somebody like them succeed. So in that vein, Margaret, thank you for spending time with me today. Thank you for all that you've done to inspire women, to provide them an opportunity to replicate what you've been able to accomplish. And thank you for joining us on this very important topic here today.
Well, thank you. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you. And I think these are great opportunities for people to learn about the industry and kind of how to do better.